So let me introduce Mary, and you probably already know most of this already. Firstly, let me say that apart from all of these things that I'm going to talk about, Mary's really main claim to fame is that she officially opened the library for us. What was that, about 18 months ago or something? Yeah. Nearly 2 years. Time flies when you're having fun. So, Mary worked in the publishing industry for 4 decades in America, London and Australia, and we're very lucky that she chose to live eventually in beautiful Berry. Her career as an editor and literary agent involved acquiring, editing and publishing fiction and non-fiction books, and working with many well-known international authors. These days, Mary is working as a freelance editor and publishing consultant, and also conducts workshops for writers' groups and centres. To add to her many and varied achievements, Mary was a founding member and is the current President and Secretary of the Organising Committee of Berry Conversations. Some of you will have heard Mary being interviewed by Geraldine Doob last Saturday morning on Radio National, where she talked about a new project that she's undertaking with another Berry resident, Christine Dunstan, called Thought Lines. This will involve a series of stimulating public presentations by university-associated experts, offered in regional centres throughout Australia, taking good thinking to the country. Great idea. Kate Legg, a journalist and novelist, said this about Mary. Mary Cunnane has a finely tuned ear for the cadence of language and the rhythm of storytelling, unflinching honesty, and a rare gift for nourishing an author's voice through however long it takes to deliver a manuscript into the world. Her insights, her grace, her humour, her gentle guidance, and her passion for the written word are qualities I treasured. As a literary midwife, she is without doubt a writer's dream. Please welcome Mary Cunnane.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for coming on today. Thank you very much, John, for that lovely introduction. I feel like and also to Janet for organizing all this. As a literary midwife, I feel that I probably should have some forceps and something handy. I've been asked to talk a bit about my career in publishing and living in various places. As you can probably tell by my funny accent, I wasn't born in Berry, but I was born, not there either. This is a Mac. I'm not a Mac person. I'm a PC person. So John may have to be my... There is where I was born. So I'm a New Yorker, born and bred. How many of you been to New York? Lots, okay. So I'm a Queens girl. I was born here in a place called Rockaway Beach, which is part of the city. Some of you, when you visited New York, flew in over it, because when you fly into Kennedy Airport, you fly into it. It's a barrier island. It's a beach colony. It's a place where at the turn of the 20th century, very wealthy New Yorkers came to have their summer holidays, and as the 20th century progressed, it became more of a kind of working class place. But I was born there. Here's what Rockaway is. So this is the entrance into the harbor. Statue of Liberty is up there. When I was a kid, because we moved from Rockaway when I was a kid, moved further into Queens, but we used to come back and spend our summers there. And in the 50s, one could stand on the boardwalk there and watch the United States, the Queen Mary, the Queen Elizabeth on the horizon, probably every week or 10 days, going back and forth. We knew from the silhouettes of the ships what they were. Anyway, we moved into Queens further up, and eventually when I was 23 years old, I left home and got my first apartment and lived in Manhattan. I can't quite reach it, but right on the river up near the top of Manhattan. My parents were immigrants from Ireland, like a lot of, they came from farming families, big families in the west of Ireland. My father's people were sheep farmers. My mother's people were mixed farmers. My father was from Mayo, my mother was from Leitrim, right on the Shannon. They came from big families, and they were economic immigrants, as a lot of people were during the Depression or just before. My father immigrated in 1928 to New York. My mother, a few years later, they didn't know each other, they met in New York. My father went to work on the New York City subway system, 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, 25 cents an hour. And ultimately, within a few years, he and a group of other young Irish guys, because it was mostly young Irish guys who were working on the New York City subway system at that time, decided to start a union. And they started the Transport Workers Union. And it was very successful. And my father spent the rest of the 1930s working as a union organizer, traveling all around New York State to Washington, D.C. It was a kind of immensely important time for him, and the TWU was a very important organization. He had only a high school education. He wanted to be a doctor. He had a scholarship to go to college or university in Ireland, but there wasn't the money to do that. So he was an autodidact, and he read very widely in American fiction, international fiction. He had a great interest in Russian history and Russian literature, which I didn't quite understand. Some of you will have this experience as you get older and your parents are dead. You wish you would have asked them more questions. Now I understand that in the early 30s, to start the Transport Workers Union, these young Irishmen, and they were only all in their early 20s, went around to the various sort of the ancient order of Hibernians and the kind of Irish community organizations asking for help and money, and they didn't get any. And this was in the depths of the Depression. And then they turned to the Communist Party, which helped them get going. My father never told me that. After he died, I went and had a look at the Robert F. Wagner Labor Library, or collection of labor history at NYU, and I found the papers. So I think probably my father was a member of the Communist Party for a lot of the 1930s. And that explained his big interest in Russian history. Then he went into the Army. He was drafted in 1939 and spent 5 or 6 years in the Army during the war. And when he came out, he left the Union and went into sort of middle management at the New York City subway system. But, and I think like a lot of people at that time, the experience of Stalin, what Stalin did in the purges, revolted him, and he left. If he ever actually belonged, he left, and if he hadn't actually belonged, he fell out of sympathy with that. But his politics he was always a very politically engaged man, deeply and widely read for someone who hadn't gone to university, and a big influence on my life. My mother was a very interesting woman. I was the only child. I was born the day before Prince Charles in 1948. So I feel like he's a twin. He went to primary school, except my ears are not as big, well, I hope. When he went to primary school, I went to primary school. When I went to high school, he went to Gordonston. When I went to university, he went to Cambridge. So I followed him with interest his whole life. I don't think he reciprocates, I'm pretty sure. But I did, in the course of publishing, once get a letter from his father. I'll tell you a little bit about that later. Do I have a picture here too? So I was the cuckoo's egg, as they say in Ireland. The cuckoo lays just one egg. I was an only child. My parents didn't marry. They met before the war, but they didn't get married until 1946. My mother was 42 when she had me. My father was 40. They couldn't have other children. So I have a severe case of the only child syndrome. People who know me think I'm a bit bossy and pedantic. I probably am. But I was much loved, and I at one time had 46 first cousins. I had the family, my parents' siblings went to England, so I have lots of family in London, Gloucester, Oxford, Scotland. I even have some family in Peru. A lot of them went to the US, mostly to New York. And it was a close family, and it was 1950s and 60s in New York. Have any of you read Brooklyn, Colm Tobin's novel? Well, that's kind of my upbringing. My parents were devout Catholics, so I spent 16 years in Catholic education, 8 years at primary school, St. Joan of Arc Primary School. Then I went to high school in Manhattan. That was a big thing because I went on the subway every day into a high school run by very progressive Dominican nuns on East 65th Street, which was a very tony part of New York. The part of New York that I was growing up in was in Woodside and Jackson Heights, was basically a working class area. I grew up in an apartment, small apartment. Had wonderful childhood. Didn't see much green grass, but played a lot, played stickball and punchball and all the things that city kids in the 50s played. And then I went to university, at Fordham University in the Bronx, up in that purple part. Jesuit University, I spent 4 years there, studied history. And then I did, much to my parents' dismay, what a lot of kids in the university kids and did in the 60s. I dropped out in my senior year. Everyone was dropping out. It's a stupid thing to do, but I did. I eventually went back, but I got some interesting jobs. I worked for the something called the International Camp Counselor Program, the World Service Division of the YWCA, and I worked in student travel at the Council on International Educational Exchange, and I traveled, and I grew up a bit, and eventually I went back and finished my degree. Can you see that list again? Because you're probably sick of looking at New York. So, One Rockefeller Plaza, is there? No, oh well, don't worry about it. I think I missed a thing there. When I finished my university degree, I thought that I wanted to be a medieval historian and get a PhD and study at Trinity College. That was a crazy idea. The worst thing I could have been was being a medieval historian. Oh, guess who that is? That's me. I was natural blonde, you can see that. And then I thought I had some crazy idea. I wanted to be an advertising copywriter, so I went to an employment agency called Career Blazers. And they said, you're probably not going to get a job as an advertising copywriter, but we have a job in a foundation, a philanthropic foundation. You've heard of the Rockefeller Foundation, the Ford Foundation. Well, I had a job in a place called the Josiah Macy Jr. Foundation. A small organization gave away $2 million a year. The money didn't come from the Macy department store family, but it came from the from a woman named, oh, that was my office. There we go. That's 1 Rockefeller Plaza. Leave that on for a second, John. So, and the Rockefeller and Ford Foundations gave away 30, 40, 50, $100 million a year. The Macy Foundation gave away about $2 million a year. Kate Macy Ladd was an heir to the Standard Oil family, I think, and also made their money in whaling oil from Nantucket, which is an island off the coast of Massachusetts. And I went along to see the man who was the president, a man named John Bowers, who is a medical doctor. He'd been the dean of the University of Wisconsin School of Medicine. He'd been in the Navy during the war. And the Macy Foundation's sole purpose was to give money for research in medical education in various forms. And they hired me to be the administrative person on 3 programs, which gave away together about half of the total $2 million. Why he hired me, I'll never know. I was 24 years old. But I spent 3 years there. There were 3 programs, one in the history of medicine and biological sciences, a fellowship program for postdocs, and they basically established that discipline in the United States. They set up centers at Harvard and Johns Hopkins. Another one was called the Macy Faculty Scholar Program, and that was to help to bring in minority group people into academic medicine. And the third was a kind of very high-end research grants for senior faculty members. And I did that for 3 years. Our office was the second from the top. I had my own office with a window looking south, and they paid me $10,000 a year, which in 1973 was a long way. I think it's about the equivalent of $50,000 or $60,000 for someone who just had a BA degree. And I enjoyed it immensely. We ran conferences. We chose doctors. I devised application forms. I met some very interesting people, including Patrick Cronin, who was the son of A.J. Cronin, the novelist, who you might remember the Citadel and the Keys of the Kingdom. He was one of my father's favorite authors. And he goes, I read those books. And when I went home one day and said, Dad, do you remember, guess I just met A.J. Cronin's son. He was gobsmacked. Gobsmacked? No. Gobsmacked sounds very rude. Gobsmacked. So I did that for 3 years. Traveled quite a bit. The Macy Foundation, as all foundations, I was very much part of the establishment. The board of directors were very wealthy people. Clarence, I can't remember his name, was the chairman of the board. He was the head of Colgate-Palmolive. Our meetings were often held in places like the Century Club, the Union Club, where no women were allowed to go, or you can only set foot on certain parts of it. I think there are clubs like that in Australia too, or have been. Very unusual for me, coming from Queens. I didn't grow up in this kind of milieu, but anyway, it was great work. But after 3 years, I decided to leave, partly because I was uncomfortable that so much of this money, which was meant to go to help people, was actually spent on first-class travel, conferences held at the Villa Bellagio. Didn't quite sit well with me. And also my boss, Dr. Bowers, to whom I reported directly, well, he's long since dead, so I can say this. We would have meeting in the morning, and we'd say, this is what you're going to do, and we published some papers together, and I helped edit some books, and as well as writing the programs, and we decide, this is what we're going to do, here's what you're going to do. And then he'd go to the Century Club, which was a men's club, it still exists now, men are allowed, and he'd have a long lunch and about 3 martinis, and he'd come back in the afternoon and he'd kind of was out of it and sort of turned upside down everything we decided to do in the morning. So as you do when you're 26, I thought, I'm resigning. I probably did it without, and I did it without another job in mind. Anyway, I presented my resignation letter, said I'd work out the month. I think they were very surprised and sad, but anyway. And then I rang up Selma Shapiro. She was the person at Career Blazers that got me to book that job in the first place. And I said, here's what's happened, Selma. And she said, don't worry, Mary, we'll get you another job at the Ford Foundation or Rockefeller or Carnegie Foundation or one of those foundations. But it'll take a little while. And I said, but I only have $900 in the bank. And I'm certainly not going to ask my parents for any money. And she said, do you know how to use a dictaphone machine? How many remember what a dictaphone machine is? And I said, no. And she said, learn. So in the last 2 weeks I was there, I asked one of the secretaries, someone who actually worked part-time for me, to teach me how to use the dictaphone machine. And I left the Macy Foundation on a Friday, and Selma rang me up and said, have you ever heard of a publishing company called W.W. Norton and Company? And I said, well, yeah, I think I have. I used the Norton Anthology of English Literature in college or in university. So she said, there's a temporary job available there. So I rocked up on the Monday morning, and the job was to work for 2 weeks as the assistant to a man named Eric Swenson, who was the editor-in-chief. His editorial assistant was on jury duty. So Eric was a lovely, lovely, lovely man. I knew nothing about publishing. I'd never thought of publishing as a career. I saw myself going on, rising up the ranks in nonprofit work. And he gave me a dictaphone belt and earphones, and I started, he said, I have a whole bunch of letters here, start typing, please type them. He didn't say start typing, he was very kind and very polite. And I started typing letters to Shirley MacLaine, to Anthony Burgess, because he'd done Clockwork Orange, to Bill Leder and Eugene Burdick, who'd written The Ugly American, to Sterling Hayden. Do any of you remember the actor Sterling Hayden, the American actor, who wrote two marvelous books? And after about the end of the first day, I thought, I'm not leaving. This is what I want to do. So that, the publishing, not anymore, but back then, used to be called the accidental profession. People kind of sort of fell into it, and I did. So I stayed 2 weeks with Eric, and there were no jobs available, permanent jobs available, so they liked me, they wanted to hire me, but they couldn't find the right job. They kept bringing me back as a temp. I worked in the publicity department, photocopying reviews, and I just hung around. And then I was introduced to the man who had just become the new president of Norton. So Norton is a completely independent firm, totally owned by its employees. It's almost 100 years old now. Very distinguished, not part of the conglomerate, has a big academic college department that do the Norton anthologies and textbooks in physics and economics and big history lists, with Freud's publisher. And then there's also the what's called in the publishing world, and especially in the United States, trade publishing. That's the part where the books that you see in a bookstore are cookbooks, novels, history, biography, just about everything. They didn't do children's books, or they had briefly, but they didn't have a children's book list. So I was introduced to the man who had just become the president. He was 46. Everybody at Norton were lifers. You started out there very young, and you stayed for most of your career. He was the head of the college department, had just been made the president. He was 46 or 47 at that point, and he needed a new assistant because the person had been working for him and he didn't think was right. I think he kind of liked the cut of my jib, and eventually he sort of tried me out in various ways. He said, "Do you know about copy editing?" And I said, "No." So he said, "I want you to copy edit a manuscript," and he gave me a very big economics, he was the economics editor, complicated economics manuscript, and a copy of the Chicago Manual of Style, which is what copy editors use to know how to mark up a manuscript. And he said, "Go away and do this." And I sweated my guts out for 4 or 5 days, and I did it. Anyway, he hired me as his assistant, which was interesting. I wanted to be, they offered me a job at the college department, but I didn't want to be doing textbooks. I wanted to be doing Shirley MacLaine and Anthony Burgess and those kinds of people. Before I actually got that job, I was hired full-time. I worked for the sales director for a while, and I worked as an assistant to another editor, and eventually I became Don's assistant, and I did that for 3 years. And it was very interesting because I got an overview of how the entire world of publishing worked, not just editing and acquiring books, but how marketing works, how publicity works, how production works. We published some really important books. The first thing he handed to me when I started full-time was the manuscript of a memoir by John Sirica, who was the judge in the famous Watergate case. I mean, Watergate was just over for a year or two. Judge Sirica was the man in the way who saved America. And they signed up his book, and Don, who was the president and the chair, said, "Here's the manuscript, put it to production, we're going on vacation," thereby giving me an ulcer that I probably had for the rest of my life. But they trusted me, and I did it, and I found myself on the telephone with Archibald Cox and various of the then famous Watergate people. And I gradually worked my way up the ladder. What I wanted to do was become an acquisitions editor, and that's the person who goes out and finds the books and signs them up. So how does one do that? Well, you either maybe switch to 42nd Street and Fifth Avenue. So that's where Norton's offices were, still are, right across from the New York Public Library. And we switched to the New Yorker. That's my favorite cover of the New Yorker, because can you go a little. So that was 500 Fifth Avenue, that was my office, right here. Well, eventually my office, when I started, I had a windowless cubicle as John's assistant, but eventually I got that office. So there were about 10 other editors, and we were responsible for finding the best possible books in a variety of areas and acquiring them for Norton. So one did that by cultivating agents, literary agents, like I eventually became when I moved to Australia. Do you all know what literary agents are? So literary agents are the people who represent the authors to publishers. They work on a commission basis. They have stables of authors, one hopes, of high quality and commercial value. So for a young editor, one had to make oneself known to the agents. So a lot of what I did, I know it sounds terrible, but it's not terrible, but I used to take agents to lunch. And that was, I had a kind of unlimited expense account, and I used to take people to lunch and sort of woo them and say who I was, and would you can I possibly steal John Updike from Random House? That kind of thing. We also went out and looked for edges, because Norton had the trade department. We had an interest in books of ideas that came out of the university, books for general readers. So I would go out to Berkeley, for example, and sort of knock on doors, have a few leads, and sort of knock on doors and say, who's doing interesting work in history, who's doing interesting work in science, and hoping that we get a book out of it. So I'm in a kind of de facto way, I had a few areas of sort of specialty. On a visit to London, because that was another really tough part of my job, I spent 2 or 3 weeks in London every year visiting British publishers looking for projects that they might want to place in America. I went to see an agent, Carolyn Doyne, still in business, and she was Richard Dawkins' editor. This is 1985. And Richard, who was an evolutionary biologist at Oxford, had published 2 books by then. One was called The Selfish Gene, which some of you may have heard of, and the other was called The Extended Phenotype. And I took his manuscript back and I said, I think we should publish this. And it was a book called The Blind Watchmaker, why the evidence of evolution reveals a universe without design. This was Richard pre his sort of ranting Richard against religion. It was before he became an ideologue in that way. This was Richard writing about evolution, and it was a brilliant book. Went on to win the Royal Society of Literature's Heinemann Award that year for the best work of nonfiction, not just science writing, but nonfiction, and the Los Angeles Times Book Award. And that was pretty memorable because the Los Angeles Times flew Richard over on the Concorde to New York, where he got on the plane with me and my husband, because the Los Angeles Times paid for the editor and the editor's spouse to fly first class to Los Angeles. That was pretty amazing. So I went on to do 2 of Richard's books, and then I published or acquired a book on physics by a man named Frank Wilczek, who went on to win the Nobel Prize in Physics in 2004. Norton also was the publisher of Stephen Jay Gould. Does that name mean anything to anyone? He was an evolutionary biologist too, a very big bestseller in the 80s and 90s. Richard and Stephen Jay Gould didn't get on. They had a disagreement on a technical issue. Stephen Jay Gould, who was at Harvard, thought his camp of evolutionary biologists thought that evolution happened in a kind of stop-start fashion. It's called punctuated equilibrium. Richard and others thought that's not the way evolution worked, that evolution was a smoother thing. And Richard, whom I liked very much, we became friends, kind of, was a bit naughty, and he had tried to make the title of one of the chapters in his book, A Theory of Evolution by Jerks, having a go at Gould. And I said, are you crazy? If you publish Gould, you can't do that. Anyway, he changed the title. So, books on science for the general reader, because those books were, some of them became bestsellers, and they were books for general readers. You would find them in Doubleday and all the major bookstores in hardcover, and in paperback. They went on to be read widely at universities. They were set books at university courses, and those were the kind of nonfiction books we liked it more than books that worked for general readers and worked for worked for university students as well. The 80s was also a time of the women's movement. I mean, certainly Germaine Greer was very big here, obviously, and around the world. We didn't publish her, but I published Kate Millett, who some of you may remember, maybe not, but a very famous book called Sexual Politics. Robin Morgan, Andrew Dworkin, woman at Carolyn Heilbrunn. These were all kind of big names back then, probably lost in the mist of time now. You all know Gloria Steinem, some of you. I tried to publish her autobiography, but unfortunately lost out. We didn't offer enough money for it, but we got to know each other, and she was close friends with some of my other authors, and I had some wonderful times at her place, her apartment, and she was a very, very interesting person. I also published Steven Pinker, another thinker, wrote a book called How the Mind Works. He's at Harvard. So science became a part of what I did, and so did medicine, because my time at the Macy Foundation, I knew a lot about medicine, more than most people did about medicine at Norton. So I did books on, I did the first book on the prostate, this, guide for men. I signed up one of the first books on the menopause back in the early 1980s, because I thought it was very important by a team of scientists and doctors. But of course, the baby boomers, as I was then, were in the 30s, and we couldn't get much publicity for it. Then a few years later, no more hot flushes or hot flashes took off like a rocket. But one of the things that an editor has to do in a house like that is to get everybody in the house, on the team, excited about the book, including the sales department. So twice a year, all the sales reps would come in from around the country. They're the people who have to sell the book to the bookstores, and they come in for a sales conference, and that's when editors you get about 3 minutes to talk about your book. And I was very enthused about The Menopause, A Guide for Women and the Men Who Love Them, it's called. And I'd only been an editor for a little while, so I was still a bit wet behind the ears. And we were all gathered around this big conference table in a rather hot, stuffy room. And I launched into my big thing about menopause. And all of a sudden I looked up, and the rep from Chicago had fallen over in a dead faint. So the whole thing, emergency stations, the conference stopped. He was carried out to the sofa in the chairman of the board's department, George Brockway. He was a very scary guy, scared the Jesus out of most younger people. Called the paramedics. I didn't know what I'd done. And then Brockway came in to me and said, "Now look what you've done." And I said, "What?" He said, "He has a deep psychological issue with hearing about women and what?" And I thought, there goes the Chicago market for this book. How's it going to present it? I think the book went on to do pretty well, even though we couldn't get the author on the Today Show, because nobody at the Today Show cared about the problems with women in middle age, not in the early 1980s. I also made mistakes, as we all do. When I was Don's assistant, he asked me to put through production a book that was a multi-authored book. I forget what it was, came out of Harvard University. It was a book of essays about America today. Nothing that was commercially important to do, but it was important for the firm to do this book. And he asked me to put it through production, and that is not to edit it, but to do all the trafficking, see that the cover was correct and everything else, which I did. And then I went on vacation And I came back 2 weeks later, and people looked at me as I walked in the door as though I was a walking corpse. And I said, what's the matter? So what I'd done is, and this taught me a big lesson, one of the contributors was a very, very important sociologist and professor at Harvard called Rosabeth Moss Cantor. And I had somehow managed, all the way through production, when I was in charge of proofreading and everything else, to put her on the cover as Elizabeth Moss Cantor. There were 5,000 copies in the warehouse, and Don, I thought, this is it, it's over, I'm back to the dictaphone, probably in an insurance office or something. And he said, we all make mistakes. He said, I rang her up. And I said, what did you say? And he said, well, we have 2 choices. We can pulp the 5,000 copies, or you can change your name. In the event, she didn't change her name, and we didn't pulp the copies. They printed 5,000 pressure-sensitive stickers to stick over the cover of the book with Rosabeth Moss Cantor on it, and not Elizabeth Moss Cantor. Around this time, Norton decided to become an international publisher, and opened an office in London, opened a branch of the firm in London, and I had something to do with that. I was the person who, besides acquiring and editing books, I also was the person who went to London every year, as I mentioned a little while ago, and I helped to start. I wasn't the person who ran it, but I was the kind of liaison between New York and London. It was fantastic, and I got to spend, as I said, 2 weeks going around London, visiting publishers, telling them about the books that we were publishing, and also finding authors whose books were published in England for Norton to take on and publish in the States. So certainly Dawkins was one of those. Lyndall Gordon, who's at Oxford, wrote a fantastic biography of Virginia Woolf. Martin Stannard, 2-volume biography of Evelyn Waugh. So I wound up doing a lot of literary biographies and a lot of British publishing. And I also, for a while, because Norton was the kind of place where everyone did a little of everything, I also became, for a while, the de facto international sales manager and helped to set up the distribution in Australia. So this is quite a while ago. And Australia gradually came on my radar screen. I became the target of opportunity for a husband and wife agenting team whose name I cannot remember any longer, I'm afraid. I couldn't remember last night. They were quite well known. And they were given the kind of portfolio, I think, by the Australian Publishers Association of books to try and sell Australian books into the American market, to sell the rights on these books to be published by American publishers. So the first thing I did was turn down The Power of One. For 2 reasons. One is we didn't publish much commercial fiction, and that was commercial fiction. And I didn't think it was a very good book. So I turned that down. I also declined Tim Winton's first novel. I've never admitted that publicly, and now that it's on YouTube, I'm in trouble. Which I think was called The Swim. No, it wasn't Derby's. It was like 1984, 85. The Swim. I think it was called The Swimmer. I meant to double check that. I didn't like it very much. But I did go on to publish Olga Masters, wonderful novelist and short story writer from down near Viga. Unfortunately, we did a 3-book contract. I didn't meet her, but I never got the chance to meet her because not long after we signed up the books and were about to publish them, she died quite suddenly of a brain tumor. She died quite suddenly. The books got marvelous reviews in the States, but without an author to promote, it was a little difficult. I got to two important Australian editors came and spent time at Norton on special, something called the Beatrice Davis Fellows, where Australian book editors were chosen by competition to go and spend time in New York publishing houses. Roseanne Fitzgibbon, who was wonderful, she was Olga Masters' publisher at UQP, University of Queensland Press, one of the best publishing houses in Australia, has a great, great literary list, started Peter Carey and all kinds of very important authors. And someone named Jacqueline Kent, who also spent time and became a friend. Jackie wrote a biography of Beatrice Davis, who was one of the most important Australian editor-publishers between just after the Second World War, I think, and before, at Angus and Robertson. And then I came to Australia for the first time in 1994 to an international feminist publishing conference in Melbourne. Now I came in August, which of course was the summer up top, and I thought Australia is this very hot country. It's going to be, I froze. I've never been so cold in my life. But it was a marvelous 3 or 4 days, and I spent time in Melbourne, and I drove up the coast to Sydney, and I met a whole group of Australian editors and publishers, and I bought the rights to one of Kaz Cook's books called Real Gorgeous. It was a book for young adolescent girls about body image and so on. We bought the rights to it, and but there were some phrases that I didn't think American readers would understand. Now it's different. It wouldn't change anything. But 30 or 25 years ago, we thought we had to. I remember reading about Tim Tams and thinking that it was Tampax. It was the American term tampons. And Susan Wyndham, who was then the U.S. correspondent for the Australian and living in New York. Some of you may have seen her at Varied Conversations 2 years ago, and she came and spoke with Susan, Charlotte Wood. We hired Susan to kind of go through the manuscript and do some translating of I can't remember some of the other things. It's so interesting how much the world has changed in 30 years, because now with the internet and streaming television and all kinds of things, half the people in the United States now say no worries. I mean, going through the passport control at Newark Airport, they go no worries. Time. Okay. Some of the other books I published, I have pictures of them, but I won't. Kenneth Branagh, the actor. When I was in London in 1982, I saw a play called Another Country, and there was this young actor in it, very young. I remember being incredibly impressed. 6 months later, I was back in New York, and I read in one of the publishing trade magazines that he'd written his autobiography. He was 28 years old. And I thought, I think we should publish this book. No one had heard of him at that point in the US. And I went to the editorial meeting, which is where editors have to say, can we sign up this book? Here's a book, I've read it, I'd like to sign it up. And you're sort of tortured by others until you can prove that you should sign it up. And I went to them and I said, you haven't heard of this guy, but we should publish the book. So I didn't have a fit. That's not him. That's Seamus Heaney, whom I also published, but I'll tell you in a second. Anyway, they allowed me to offer $10,000 for the American rights, still not knowing who this guy was, but sort of trusting me. And about a month or two before we published, Henry V opened. Do you remember that film? Magnificent film. And all of a sudden he was the flavor of the month, and he came out, he and Emma and the theater company that he ran at that time went to Chicago. They were doing King Lear, and I flew out to meet him. And there was a line around the block and around the block and around the block on Michigan Avenue at the bookstore, and I thought, this will pay off, and it did. Seamus Heaney, who won the Nobel Prize for Literature, the great Irish poet, the late great Irish poet, I met in the early 90s when he was professor of poetry at Harvard. I had great interest in Irish literature and things, as you might imagine. So one of the last books that I commissioned was his translation of Beowulf, which was published by Norton in its Norton Anthology and by Faber in the UK. In fact, the day before I finally left Norton, we had a lunch and brought the first 1,200 lines of his translation of Beowulf. We had a memorable lunch, having more than a few martinis. I should step this up really quickly. So that was my career at Norton, and I loved it, and I had a great time. I moved to Australia in '98. I worked for a year for Transworld, which is part of Random House, as the nonfiction publisher. I published Troy Dan. Do you remember Troy Dan? I had no idea who Troy Dan was. No one does anyway anymore. But, and Chris Gilby. Some of you know Chris Gilby, a Barrie resident. No? Yeah. He published it. He did a book called How to Survive Y2K in Australia. Remember Y2K? It was '98. That became a bestseller briefly. And then I started a literary agency because everyone said, a lot of people in publishing said to me, we need another agent here, we don't have enough literary agents, we don't have enough representation. So I took a deep breath and started the Mary Cunnane Agency. I wound up representing about 40 Australian writers, selling their work to publishers in Australia, but also overseas, because that was the great, and is the great, desire of every Australian writer, is to be published overseas. At that, 20 years ago, there wasn't a lot of experience and expertise among British publishers on how to get their authors, Australian publishers, how to get their authors overseas, and of course, I did know. And so some of the authors I represented were Peter Doherty. He's my third Nobel laureate. I am boasting here. Frank Wilczek, Nobel laureate for physics in 2004. Seamus won the Nobel Prize in Literature, I think in around 2000. And Peter Doherty, not the rock star, but Peter Doherty, the eminent scientist based in Melbourne, won the Nobel Prize in Medicine and Biology in 1995. And I read an article about him. He was Australian of the Year in 1996, and I wrote him a letter and I said, would you be interested in writing books for general readers? And he said yes, and there he is with his wife winning the Nobel Prize. 1994, just after the election, which John Howard won and Mark Latham didn't. I'd been in Australia about 6 years at that point. I thought, I bet Mark Latham might have an interesting story, so I wrote him a letter, waited for about a month or 6 weeks, got a telephone call, and he said, as a matter of fact, I do have a manuscript, I've been keeping diaries. So I met him in a Chinese restaurant in Bankstown, and we had a wild ride. A lot of publishers vied for that book. I know, it was very controversial, but I still think it was an important book to publish, and he's a very good writer. I won't say anything about the last 5 years because I haven't seen him or been in contact with him for 5 years, but that was a very interesting time. I was totally besieged by the press. I've never been in anything like that before or since. Kim Scott, the novelist who won the Miles Franklin Award. So I represented a lot of important historians who were writing books for general readers. So I kept doing as a literary agent what I did as a publisher. I closed the agency in 2013 because it's hard yakka, and because I got sick of the unglamorous parts of it, which is negotiating contracts and scrutinizing royalty statements, not the most interesting part of the business. And I set up shop as a freelance editor and consultant, so I do a lot of freelance editing now. I act as a program advisor for the ACT Writer Center. I do judging for various literary competitions, and I still love publishing. I think Australia is a fantastic place for writers and has wonderful writers, and more of whom are developing international reputations. That was one of my, Jackie Kent was looking around for a new subject. This was when she was still deputy leader before the coup, and not Jackie, but Julia. And I said, what about a biography of Julia Gillard? And that went on to do 3 editions and sold, I think it was briefly a bestseller for a while. So I had an interesting time here. And to finish, I should tell you about a new project that I'm involved in that John alluded to with my very good friend Christine Dunstan, who was a noted theater producer, lives on Woodhill Mountain Road. So we just started this. This is what I spoke with Geraldine Duke about on Saturday. And I also give workshops at universities for faculty members, academics who want to learn how to write books that will appeal to general readers. And I've done this at Macquarie and University of Adelaide and Monash University. And it struck me that there's such a treasure trove of knowledge in Australian universities, many of which are world-class universities, doing very important work in the sciences, philosophy, that more people ought to know about them and hear about what they do. So I went to Christine and I said, would you be interested in partnering with me on this initiative? And the initiative is to take outstanding teachers on a variety of subjects who were known to be lively lecturers and good lecturers and take them out to regional Australia. People who live in capital cities or near capital cities can get to writers' festivals and festivals of ideas, but the people in Wagga Wagga and places like that don't have much of that. So we're starting this Thought Lines program in September. We started September 5th in Orange. We've got an historian, an astronomer, Lisa Cooley, who's a brilliant astrophysicist at the ANU, and James Lawrenson of UTS, who's an expert on China and Australia. And we're offering well, we call it a day of learning, but it's kind of a half day of learning. 3 presentations, coffee break, lunch, a final presentation, and then an opportunity to mix and mingle with the talent. And these are being given at the civic theaters, the Orange Civic Theatre, the West Gippsland
Performing Arts Centre.
West Gippsland Performing Arts Centre in Warragul in Gippsland, and at the Wagga Wagga Civic Theatre. And the response so far has been fabulous. Geraldine Duke was kind of leaping down the microphone saying what a great idea she thought it was. So we'll see in September how we do. Over and out.